In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy still believed that well-trained carrier air groups flying low and fast could break through the anti-aircraft belts of American task forces. The Battle of the Coral Sea showed exactly how that doctrine looked in practice. On 7 May 1942, American carrier aircraft from Lexington and Yorktown found and sank the light carrier Shoho in a concentrated strike that removed one of Japan's available decks for the battle. But the next day, 8 May, the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku launched their own strikes against Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Among the attackers were Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers, the same basic Kate type that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor. They were directed by the carrier force under Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, with Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara commanding the carrier division. The Japanese crews executed what they had trained for a coordinated attack, with dive bombers from above and torpedo planes dragging in at wave-top height to force the American ships to defend in two directions at once. Those B-5N torpedo bombers depended on a simple formula. They approached low, often below 100 feet, to keep under the best engagement zone of shipboard guns. They tried to hold about 200 knots on the run-in, so that the torpedo would enter the water cleanly and stabilize fast. Japanese crews liked a short release range, roughly several hundred to around 800 yards, because the shorter the run in the water, the less time the target had to comb the wakes. In the Coral Sea, action on 8 May, Lexington was hit by torpedoes and bombs and suffered uncontrollable fires that later forced her crew to abandon ship. Yorktown was also damaged, though she survived and was repaired in time to fight at Midway. So in 1942, the Japanese torpedo attack profile still worked. Fly very low, release close, trust the skill of the crew, and count on the fact that American guns were still relying mainly on timed fuses and contact bursts that were easiest to dodge when you were skimming the sea. Midway on 4 June 1942 repeated the basic pattern. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force sent in coordinated strikes that mixed Aichi D3A dive bombers with Nakajima B5N torpedo planes. American combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire inflicted losses, but the Japanese torpedo planes from Hiryu still managed to get through and hit USS Yorktown with torpedoes. That success came from the same ingredients as Coral Sea skilled pilots, low-level approaches, and the fact that U.S. ships were not yet surrounded by a wall of near-bursting AA shells. In other words, 1942 was still a window in which a determined Japanese torpedo squadron could rush a U.S. carrier or cruiser and have a reasonable chance of at least some aircraft reaching release point. What your title points to, though, is the part of the story that comes later. After 1942, the U.S. Navy began to add the things that make low-level attacks die. Radar direction of fire improved. Anti-aircraft batteries on major ships multiplied in number and in layers. Most importantly, the introduction and wider employment of radio proximity fuses. VT-fuzed meant that an anti-aircraft shell no longer had to be set to explode at a guessed distance or rely on a direct hit. A shell with a proximity fuse could detonate when it came close to an aircraft, throwing fragments into the path of low-fast attackers. That single change made the sea-skimming approach that had worked for B-5Ns in 1942 far more dangerous by 1943-44. A pilot who tried to hug the water at a steady speed and height, exactly the profile needed for a clean torpedo drop, was now presenting the best possible target to layered, radar-directed guns, firing VT-fused ammunition. By the mid-war period, the logic had flipped. In 1942, precision and courage could buy success because the defenses were still using older fusing and thinner fire control. By 1943-44, the defenses had become dense enough that repeating the same low-level torpedo run was close to suicide. That is what the second half of the line, then proximity fuses made, low-level suicide is getting, at the Japanese early war torpedo doctrine was sound for the environment of 1941-42, but it did not scale against an expansion American fleet that had added radar more, 5-inch and 40 millimeters, fire better directors, and VT fuses. The same bravery, the same flight profile, the same close-range drop that had hurt Lexington at Coral Sea would a year or two later have been shredded before the aircraft ever reached the 800-yard point. So, The corrected arc is this Coral Sea proved Japanese carrier air groups could still punch through. Midway showed they could still put torpedoes into a U.S. carrier, even under pressure. But the rapid thickening of American anti-aircraft defenses and the arrival of proximity fuses turned that once effective low-level torpedo run into a tactic that cost too many aircraft for too little gain. That matches your title much more cleanly than the first version. By 26 October 1942 inches, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the pattern of 1942 carrier warfare, was still in Japan's favor at the tactical level. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo brought the core of the remaining First Air Fleet to the fight with Shokaku Zuikaku and Zuiho, while the carrier Junyo operated in support. Opposite him were the hard-used American carrier groups in the South Pacific Task Force 16 with USS Enterprise under Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid and Task Force 17 with USS Hornet under Rear Admiral George D. Murray. The Americans had learned from Coral Sea and Midway, but their defenses were still built around 1,942 anti-aircraft ideas. Radar that struggled to hold very low targets, 5-inch guns using timed fuses, 1.1-inch mounts that could and did jam under sustained fire, and not yet the kind of radar-directed VT-fuzed wall of fire that would appear later. Japanese strike doctrine on that day looked like it had in the earlier 1942 battles send mixed waves of Aichi D3A dive bombers and Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers forced the American fighters and gunners to split their attention and let the torpedo planes come in low over the water. The B5N, the same basic Kate type that had helped cripple American battleships at Pearl Harbor, was still dangerous in this environment. Cruz flew in at wave-top height to stay under the best engagement zone of American fire control. At that altitude, around 100 feet or less, a carrier task force did not get as much warning from radar directors, had less time to lay, and 5-inch guns firing shells set to burst at a guessed range simply did not have the same kill probability. The attacker needed a stable straight-in run to drop a torpedo cleanly. The defender needed to hit a fast, small target that was almost level with the sea. That trade still favored the attacker in late 1942. Santa Cruz proved it. Hornet was hit repeatedly by bombs and torpedoes from these Japanese strikes and was left dead in the water. Efforts to tow her failed, and she was scuttled by Japanese destroyers. Enterprise was also hit and damaged by bombs. What matters for your title is that the Japanese torpedo bombers were still able to reach release points because the American anti-aircraft system of 1942 could not reliably break up a determined, well-flown, very low attack. The radar picture degraded close to the surface. The medium AA was not yet the superb 40mm Bofors Webb that would later guard fast carriers, and the 1.1-inch mounts were a known weak point. In that environment, a B5N crew that stayed low held speed and dropped at a few hundred to around 800 yards could still hurt a U.S. carrier. But Santa Cruz also showed the Americans exactly what they needed to fix. They could not keep trading carriers with an enemy that still had trained torpedo crews. So, the U.S. Navy pushed harder on the two things that would make the second half of your title true. First, they thickened the anti-aircraft envelope, more 40mm and 20mm better, radar direction, more guns per ship, better fighter direction. Second, and more decisive for low flyers, they accelerated the development and fielding of radio proximity fuses, the VT-fuzed, that had been under work at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. A VT-fuzed shell did not have to be told in advance where to burst. It sensed the target and detonated when it was close. That single change erased a big part of the advantage Japanese torpedo planes had been using since 1941, the ability to sneak in low inside the sweet spot of the defender's fire and still complete a straight torpedo drop. Once VT-fuses began to appear in quantity on U.S. ships, and once carrier task groups were ringed with heavier radar-directed AA, the old B5N-style sea-skimming run stopped being a high-skill, high-reward tactic and started looking like a good way to lose pilots. A torpedo bomber has to fly predictably in its final seconds. VT-fuses punish predictable flight paths. Early in the war, you could rush the fleet because guns were firing time fuses at a height your plane was not in. Later in the war, the shell itself reached for you. That is the turn your title describes in 1942 at Santa Cruz. Japanese torpedo bombers could still press their advantage. In the VT era, that followed the same low-level run, was close to suicide. On 5 January 1943 south of Guadalcanal, the pattern finally broke. The light cruiser USS Helena, operating under Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth, opened fire with 5-inch guns using the new Mark 32 radio proximity fuses and knocked an incoming Japanese Aichi D3A out of the sky with the second salvo. The shell did not have to guess the altitude or rely on a contact hit. The fuse carried a tiny radio set that triggered the burst when it came close to the target, scattering fragments exactly where the airplane was. For the first time in the Pacific, an American ship had a gun round that could reach for a low-fast attacker instead of watching it slip under timed bursts. That single success mattered because, up to the end of 1942, Japanese carrier and land-based air units had lived off one weakness of Allied defenses. Low-level and torpedo approaches were hard to track and hard to hit. Nakajima B5N Cruz could run in at 100 feet, hold a steady line for the torpedo drop, and know that most of the 5-inch shells were bursting too high or too far away. In 1942, that had been a strength. After Helena's demonstration, it became a liability. A torpedo bomber that flies straight and level at low altitude is presenting the perfect profile for a proximity-fused shell. The Navy understood what it had. Through early and mid-1943, more of these VT-fused 5-inch rounds were fed into Pacific stocks and ships that had spent 1942 throwing up guest height barrages could now throw up kill zones. Instead of a few lucky hits, a task group could break up an entire Japanese strike before it reached 800 yards. The distance torpedo pilots liked because it gave the weapon a short, hard-to-dodge run. The old Japanese logic, stay low, stay fast, stay steady, was now exactly what the American guns wanted. Dive bombers coming down through the envelope and B5N torpedo bombers skimming in from seaward both had to pass through air that could explode around them without warning. By the middle of 1943, that was the real shift behind the line. Japanese torpedo bombers rushed the fleet. Then, proximity fuses made low-level suicide. In 1942, rushing the fleet in a Kate could work because radar dipped near the surface and shells burst where the ship hoped the plane would be. In 1943, with proximity, fuses riding in the 5-inch batteries of fast carrier groups and cruiser screens. The same low-level run meant flying straight into shells that armed themselves and exploded when they got close. The tactic had not changed, but the environment had, and that was enough to turn a proven Japanese strength into a deadly gamble. By 19 June 1944 inches, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the environment that had once let Japanese torpedo bombers skim in at wave-top height, was gone. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher's task force, 58, operating under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance met Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, with a screen of radar-directed F-6F Hellcats overhead and ships whose 5-inch batteries now fired proximity-fused ammunition as a matter of routine. Ozawa could still launch large mixed strike groups, but they were no longer flying into the 1942 Pacific. They were flying into a defended bubble. Japan's carrier air groups had been rebuilt in 1944 with newer types, torpedo bombers like the B6N and dive bombers like the D4Y, but the doctrine underneath was still born in the 1941-42 world of low approaches and coordinated multi-axis attacks. Over the Philippine Sea, those strike groups were detected early by American radar, intercepted far out by Hellcats, and broken up before they could descend to the altitudes where Japanese pilots had once been most dangerous. What survived the fighter screen then had to run through U.S. ships whose AA now used VT-fuzed shells that did not wait for a preset time to burst but exploded when they came close. A torpedo bomber that had to steady itself for a drop now flew through air that could suddenly erupt around it. This was the fulfillment of the trend that had begun off Guadalcanal in early 1943. In 1942, at Coral Sea Midway and Santa Cruz, Japanese torpedo and low-level attackers could still reach American carriers because radar had blind spots near the surface, and AA relied on time fuses. In 1943, when cruisers like USS Helena proved proximity fuses at sea, the U.S. Navy gained the tool that punishes low, straight, predictable flight. By 1944, that tool was in the hands of a much larger, better drilled fast carrier force. The result at the Philippine Sea was that Japanese strike waves lost most of their aircraft to fighters and the remainder to dense VT-backed barrages. The old Japanese strength, low-altitude precision, had no airspace left to live in. Japanese pilots saw it in real time. Formations broke up under Hellcat attacks. Surviving crews had to climb or maneuver instead of staying in the clean torpedo run profile, and attacks that in 1942 might have put weapons into an American carrier now ended with scattered drops or no drops. The mobile fleet lost hundreds of aircraft in the 2 days of fighting, not because every plane was shot by a VT shell, but because American radar fighters and proximity-fused AA together made the classic low-level approach a bad bet. That is exactly what your title describes early in the war. Japanese torpedo bombers could rush the fleet and get results. By the time of the Philippine Sea, the same style of attack against a fleet armed with VT fuses and strong cap was effectively suicidal. By 1945 off Okinawa, the air battlefield that had once favored Japanese low-altitude attackers was gone. The Imperial Japanese Navy still had Nakajima B5N Tenzan torpedo bombers and a scattering of older Kates, but the trained torpedo crews of 1,942 were largely gone, and the carriers that had launched them had mostly been sunk in. What Japan could still do was send in large desperate strike and suicide formations against an American fleet that was now ringed with radar pickets, fighter cover, and 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused ammunition. The very profile that had made Japanese torpedo planes dangerous in 1942, straight low steady, was in 1945 the easiest thing for an American ship to kill. When waves came in during the April attacks, ships on the radar line and in the main body were already at action stations. Fighters were vectored out first. What leaked through met 5-inch batteries that could fire rapidly and whose shells no longer had to guess the height of the target. A VT fuse burst when it was close to the aircraft, throwing fragments straight into a kamikaze diving low or a Tenzan trying to level out. That turned the last generation of Japanese naval aircraft into targets that died on approach. Pilots talked about shells going off for no reason because there was no visible time setting, just sudden explosions around the plane. This was the logical end of the line that had started at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. In 1942, Japanese torpedo bombers could rush a task force and get hits because American radar dipped near the surface and AA depended on time fuses. In 1943, when ships like Helena proved the Mark 32 proximity fuse at sea, the United States got a weapon that punished low, predictable flight. By 1944, the fast carrier forces carried VT routinely. At Okinawa in 1945, with many more picket ships, better radar direction, and thick AA screens, a Japanese aircraft trying to fly the old low-level attack saw almost no safe altitude left. What had been a skilled, precise torpedo doctrine became, in the face of VT-equipped, radar-guided American firepower, a series of forced, often suicidal runs. That is exactly the turn your title describes. They could rush the fleet in 1942. By the time of Okinawa, the same approach was crushed in front of the ships. By early 1945, Japan's carrier-style torpedo arm was essentially spent. The old Nakajima B5N Kates and the newer B6N Tenzans still existed on paper. But after the 1944 carrier battles and the loss of trained naval aviators, what Japan could actually put over the U.S. fast carriers was a thin, poorly coordinated mix of strike and special attack aircraft. When Task Force 58 covered the Iwo Jima landings in February 1945, American ships were no longer relying on 1942-style guest height barrages. They had radar warning fighter direction, thick 40mm belts, and 5-inch batteries that could fire proximity-fused rounds that burst automatically near a low-fast target. That was exactly the kind of target Japanese torpedo planes had to be in order to drop. This is where the story in your title flips. In 1942, a Kate, or later, a well-flown torpedo bomber could come in at wave-top height, hold a straight run, and trust that most of the American shells would burst above it or behind it. In 1945, that same straight, low, predictable run was the easiest thing for an American ship to kill. A proximity fuse in a 5-inch shell did not care if the attacker was at 100 feet or 300 feet. If the shell passed close, it detonated and filled the air with fragments. What the Japanese pilots experienced was not a wall they could weave through, but sudden bursts around the airplane even when they thought they were in the radar blind zone. That is why so many late-war attacks degenerated into kamikaze dives. The old torpedo profile could no longer be executed under that fire. The B6N, introduced in 1943 to replace the B5N, was faster and carried a good torpedo. But by 1945, it was being flown by pilots who did not have the long pre-war carrier training syllabus, and the airplane did not have the armor and fuel protection to survive a 5-inch VT burst. American picket destroyers and cruisers could keep up a high rate of fire, and every round was a real threat, not just a warning. So even when Japanese units tried to send small groups against the Iwo Jima, covering force, most of what reached gun range was shot down by a combination of fighters and VT-backed AA before it could level out and release. The result was the same as at Okinawa. A few weeks later, Japan still launched airplanes, but it was no longer practicing the 1,942 torpedo doctrine. It was throwing away airframes against an air defense system designed to kill low flyers. That version matches your title at the start of the Pacific War. Japanese torpedo bombers really could rush the fleet. By 1945, against radar-directed fighters and ships, armed with proximity, fuses trying to fly, the same low-level attack was effectively a suicide mission. In April 1945, off Okinawa, the style of naval air attack that had made Japan so dangerous in 1941-42 finally died. The Imperial Japanese Navy could still put B6N Tenzan torpedo bombers and a few surviving B5Ns into the air, but the trained carrier aviators, who had once flown perfect low-level approaches, were gone. The big fleet carriers that had launched them in 1942-43 had mostly been sunk the previous year, and what remained was thrown in together with kamikaze aircraft. They were flying into the most heavily defended American naval screen of the Pacific War. Radar pickets, fighter direction, thick medium AA, and 5-inch batteries that now used proximity fuses as standard. On 6-7 April, when Japanese units sent in large mixed raids, the U.S. ships under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance did not fight the way they had at Coral Sea. Fighters went out first and cut down the incoming groups. What got through had to run the gauntlet of 5-inch guns firing fast with shells that did not have to guess the target's height. A proximity fuse would burst when it came close, throwing fragments straight into an aircraft that was diving or trying to steady for a torpedo. In 1942, 800 yards was the range a Kate or later a Jill wanted, short water run, high hit chance. In 1945, 800 yards in front of a VT-equipped radar alert American task group was just the part of the sky where the bursts got thickest. That was the real change. Early in the war, Japanese torpedo bombers could rush the fleet because they lived in the radar dead space, and American shells burst where the ship hoped the plane would be. By Okinawa, the same low, straight, predictable flight profile was exactly what U.S. gunners and VT shells were built to kill. Pilots saw explosions with no visible time setting and no easy way to jink clear. With veteran crews gone, and replacement pilots never fully trained in torpedo run discipline, the Japanese side began to fall back on one thing that did not require surviving the AA envelope crashing straight in. At that point, the torpedo bomber era was over, not because the airplanes could not carry torpedoes anymore, but because American radar-guided fighters and proximity-fused barrages had made the classic Japanese low-level attack a suicidal act.